The ground was still covered in concrete dust. The flowers in my garden had been crushed to a pulp under the wheels of construction vehicles. And in the midst of all the chaos, my no trespassing sign was still firmly planted like a declaration of war. She, with a fake smile and calculating eyes, stood on my land and gave orders as if the whole neighborhood was her own private domain. They didn't ask permission, didn't give notice, just blatantly poured sugar across the clear boundary. And when I spoke up, they labeled me a troublemaker. But what they didn't know was that I had been preparing for it all along. The power play they were staging. Today it was my turn to turn the tables. I love my quiet life now, tending my small garden on the weekends, reading thick legal documents with a cup of coffee in hand. I'm David Martinez, 38, just a regular guy who's lived in Oakwood Heights for the past 15 years. I'm just a low-level government employee who spends her days burying her head in mindless paperwork. She, Lindsay Walsh, 36, the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood for the past 3 years. With her short, perfectly styled blonde hair, icy blue eyes, and dazzling fake smile, she always stands out. But there's something very important that Lindsay doesn't know about me. Something she'll regret the day she decides to start a fight with the wrong person. The whole nightmare began 3 months ago when Lindsay announced her grand vision to modernize and improve traffic flow throughout our established neighborhood. She wanted to widen the main entrance and create additional visitor parking spaces, claiming it would boost all our property values and bring Oakwood Heights into the 21st century. Behind closed doors, using her considerable powers of persuasion and political maneuvering, she had somehow convinced the other HOA board members to approve her ambitious construction project for a brand new access road. The first real conflict erupted on a crisp Tuesday morning when I noticed several workers in hard hats starting to survey and measure areas right along my carefully maintained property line. When I politely approached them and asked what they were doing, they explained they were preparing the groundwork for major road construction. Concerned about how this might affect my property, I immediately called Lindsay to inquire about the details. She responded with that dismissive, officious tone she reserves for people she considers beneath her station. That's an HOA infrastructure project, David, and you really don't need to concern yourself with the technical details. We have all the proper permits and legal documentation. When I respectfully asked if I could review the paperwork, Lindsay flatly refused without hesitation. You're not a board member, so those documents are strictly internal HOA business that doesn't concern regular residents. A second major conflict happened exactly 1 week later when I found an official-looking violation notice taped to my front door, complete with a $200 fine for allowing weeds and unmaintained vegetation to grow excessively high in my front garden area. Confused and irritated, I immediately went outside to investigate and discovered they were referring to my carefully cultivated wildflowers that I was deliberately allowing to go to seed for next season's natural garden plants that were barely 6 inches tall and clearly intentional landscaping. When I called Lindsay to protest this obviously unfair citation, she responded with icy coldness. The HOA regulations clearly state that grass and vegetation cannot exceed 4 inches in height. David, you're in direct violation of our community standards. Something felt very wrong about this, so I dug out my copy of the HOA Regulation Handbook and made a disturbing discovery. The grass height requirement had mysteriously been updated from 6 inches down to 4 inches with an effective date of just 2 days earlier without any community notification or voting process. The third escalation occurred during the next scheduled HOA board meeting, where Lindsay decided to make a public example of me in front of approximately 30 of my neighbors. With her most authoritative voice, she announced, "Unfortunately, we have certain residents in our community who consistently refuse to cooperate with important development projects that benefit everyone. These individuals have shown themselves to be selfish and short-sighted, actively opposing progress and improvements that would enhance our neighborhood's appeal and property values." Every single pair of eyes in that crowded room immediately turned toward me, and I could feel the weight of their collective stare. I stood up calmly and requested the opportunity to respond to these vague accusations, but Lindsay immediately shut me down. "This is an informational meeting, not a public debate forum." David, in the days and weeks that followed that humiliating public shaming, I began experiencing subtle but unmistakable social isolation throughout the neighborhood. Some of my longtime neighbors started actively avoiding eye contact and crossing the street when they saw me coming. Others would stop their conversations mid-sentence and whisper among themselves when I walked past their driveways. I could feel the entire community slowly turning against me, based solely on Lindsay's calculated manipulation and character assassination, without anyone bothering to hear my side of the story. A fourth major confrontation occurred when Lindsay's construction project officially broke ground on what was supposed to be a beautiful spring morning. I was jolted awake at 6 a.m. by the aggressive rumbling of heavy machinery and diesel engines right outside my bedroom window. When I rushed outside, still in my pajamas and robe, I was shocked to see a crew of workers with excavators actively digging foundation trenches in an area that I was absolutely certain fell within my property boundaries. I politely but firmly asked the construction foreman to temporarily halt work so we could verify the exact property lines and review the building plans. The foreman, clearly just following orders, explained that he was working strictly according to instructions provided by the HOA board and didn't have authority to make changes. That's when Lindsay herself appeared on the scene, her face already flushed red with indignation and barely controlled anger. "David, you have absolutely no legal right whatsoever to obstruct or interfere with this legally approved construction project that has been properly permitted through all appropriate channels." I kept my voice calm and reasonable as I responded. "Lindsay, I'm not trying to obstruct anything, but I have serious concerns that this excavation might be taking place on my private property." Her reaction was immediate and condescending. "Your property? Are you seriously delusional enough to think you own half the neighborhood? This is clearly designated public land that belongs to the entire community." Her arrogance and dismissive attitude were absolutely breathtaking. But I managed to maintain my composure instinctively, knowing that patience and careful documentation would serve me far better than losing my temper or escalating the confrontation. The fifth and most dramatic conflict reached its climax when I made the decision to take a clear stand and protect my rights. I carefully positioned a large, professionally made, unpredictable, and annoying construction zone. Lindsay's response was swift and nuclear. She immediately called 911, breathlessly reporting what she described as a dangerous individual obstructing legal construction and making threats against our workers. When 3 police cruisers arrived with sirens blaring and lights flashing, Lindsay put on the performance of her lifetime, playing the role of an innocent victim under siege. "Officer, this man has been systematically harassing me and other board members for weeks now. He violently opposes every single effort we make to improve our community. Now he's physically obstructing permitted construction work and creating a hostile environment for our contract." I stood there in stunned silence, watching this masterful, theatrical performance unfold in front of the police officers, in front of dozens of my neighbors who had been drawn outside by the commotion, and in front of several people who were discreetly recording everything with their smartphones. At that precise moment, I finally understood Lindsay's true strategy. She didn't just want to build her precious road project. She wanted to completely destroy my reputation and turn me into the neighborhood pariah, the unreasonable troublemaker that everyone would blame for opposing progress and community improvement. But there was one crucial element that Lindsay had failed to calculate into her elaborate scheme. Sometimes the people who appear to be the most powerless and vulnerable actually possess resources and authority that she couldn't even begin to imagine. When the first uniformed police officer approached me, with his hand resting casually on his utility belt, I took a deep breath and calmly reached into my back pocket to retrieve my leather wallet. I pulled out my official government identification card and spoke in a quiet, professional tone that only the officer could hear. "Good morning, officer. I'm David Martinez, Senior Inspector with the Harrison County Land Management Bureau. I need you to help me investigate what appears to be a serious property boundary violation in unpermitted construction situation." The officer's entire demeanor and body language changed instantly when he examined my credentials. He straightened up his expression, becoming more serious and respectful. "What exactly do you need us to do?" "Inspector Martena, I need you to immediately request that all construction activity be halted until we can verify property boundaries and review the required building permits," I explained methodically. There are clear indicators of multiple violations of county land use regulations and possibly criminal trespass. Lindsay was still standing about 10 feet away, just gesticulating wildly and continuing her dramatic monologue to the other officers, completely unaware that the entire dynamic of the situation had just shifted dramatically in my favor. She was angrily addressing the growing crowd of neighbors. Do you all see what's happening here? This man thinks he can intimidate hardworking contractors and disrupt legitimate community improvements just because he has some kind of personal vendetta against progress. The lead officer walked directly over to Lindsay, his official tone cutting through her theatrical performance. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to immediately stop all construction activities and provide documentation of your building permits and property surveys. Lindsay's confident expression faltered for the first time, replaced by obvious confusion and the beginning of panic. Building permits? What are you talking about? This is an internal HOA infrastructure project. We don't need special permits for improvements to community-owned land. The officer's response was professional but firm. Ma'am, do you have any official documentation that proves this land is actually owned by your homeowner's associate? Lindsay hesitated for several long seconds, her perfectly composed facade beginning to crack under pressure. Well, of course. This is obviously I'll need to retrieve those documents from our office files. At this crucial moment, I pulled out my smartphone and opened the official county government app that I use daily in my professional capacity. I scanned the QR code printed on my house number sign, and within seconds, my phone screen displayed a detailed, legally accurate cadastral survey map of the entire area. Officer, I said calmly, I think you should take a look at this official county mapping data. The screen clearly showed my property boundaries marked with precise red lines, and it was immediately obvious that the entire construction zone fell completely within my private property boundaries, a full 15 feet away from any public right-of-ways or community-owned land. The officer carefully compared the digital map with the physical construction site, then radioed for additional backup units and requested that a county surveying specialist respond to the scene immediately. Lindsay was beginning to realize that something had gone terribly wrong with her carefully planned confrontation. Wait just a minute. What exactly are you people suggesting? This is clearly public land that belongs to the entire community. Mrs. Walsh, I said, addressing her formally and professionally for the first time since this entire ordeal began. I need to officially inform you that you and your homeowners association are currently in serious violation of multiple county and state laws regarding private property rights. As a senior inspector with the Harrison County Land Management Bureau, I have both the authority and the legal obligation to pursue prosecution for these violent. Lindsay's face went completely pale, as if all the blood had suddenly drained from her head. The crowd of neighbors surrounding us began murmuring among themselves, and I could see the shock and confusion spreading through their ranks. This can't be happening, Lindsay stammered, her usual commanding presence completely evaporating. Who are you, really? You told everyone you were just a low-level government clerk who does boring paperwork. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile as I responded. That's absolutely correct, Lindsay. I do work with paperwork and regulations on a daily basis. Specifically, I work with the paperwork and legal regulations that govern land management property rights and construction permits for this entire county and 3 surrounding municipalities. Just then, a white county vehicle pulled up to the curb and outstepped a surveying specialist whom I recognized immediately. Jim Patterson, a colleague I'd worked with on dozens of property disputes over the years. He approached us with his professional equipment and greeted me warmly. Hey there, Dave, dispatch said. You've got a boundary dispute situation that needs immediate attention. Over the next 30 minutes, Jim conducted a thorough survey of the area and confirmed exactly what I had known from the very beginning. The entire construction project was located on my private property, with no portion extending onto public land or HOA-controlled territory. But Jim's investigation revealed even more serious problems that I hadn't initially suspected. First, he discovered that the HOA had submitted falsified documentation to the county, claiming they had obtained a verbal easement agreement with me for the land use, something that had never happened and would have required written contracts anyway. Second, They had proceeded with major construction without applying for any of the required building permits with the county, which was a serious violation of municipal regulations that carried substantial fines and potential criminal charges. When Jim announced these findings to the assembled crowd, I could see the neighbors' attitudes beginning to shift dramatically. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor, who had lived across the street for 20 years, stepped forward with obvious remorse written across her face. "David, I owe you a sincere apology. We had no idea what was really happening here. Lindsay made it sound like you were just being difficult and selfish. But the most surprising and unexpected support came from someone I would never have predicted." Robert Walshua's own husband emerged from the crowd with a grim, determined expression on his face. "David," Robert said in a clear voice that everyone could hear, "I want to apologize to you on behalf of my wife. I warned Lindsay multiple times about the legal problems with this project, but she refused to listen to my concerns." Lindsay spun around to face her husband, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "Robert, what do you think you're doing? You're supposed to support me." Robert's response was calm but resolute. "I'm doing what's right, Lindsay. I have a law degree from State University, and I've known from day one that you were breaking multiple laws with this project." The entire dynamic of the confrontation had completely transformed. It was no longer just me standing alone against the HOA's abuse of power. Now I had the backing of law enforcement, county officials, and even members of Lindsay's own family. The crowd of neighbors was beginning to understand that they had been manipulated and lied to, and their anger was starting to redirect toward the person who had deceived them. Lindsay stood there in the middle of the street, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed authority, finally beginning to understand that her reign of suburban tyranny was coming to an abrupt end. 3 days after that explosive confrontation, an emergency HOA meeting was called at the Oakwood Heights Community Center, a large windowless room that typically hosted bingo nights and children's birthday parties. Lindsay had desperately tried to postpone or cancel the meeting, but according to the HOA's own bylaws, when 30% of the membership formally requests an emergency session, it must be convened within 72 hours, regardless of the board's preferences. I arrived at the community center carrying a professional black leather briefcase filled with carefully organized documents, evidence, and legal precedents that I had prepared with the same methodical attention to detail that I brought to my day job. The normally quiet community center was absolutely packed with residents. Nearly 200 people had shown up, which was more than double the attendance of any previous HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. The air was thick with tension and anticipation, and you could practically feel the electricity of impending drama crackling through the room. Folding chairs had been hastily arranged in rows, and people were standing along the walls when the seating ran out. Lindsay sat at the head table, looking like she was facing a firing squad, desperately trying to project an image of calm authority, but I could clearly see her hands trembling as she shuffled through a stack of papers. Beside her sat the other two board members, Tom Bradley, a retired accountant, and Sarah Kim, a part-time real estate agent, both of whom were studiously avoiding eye contact with anyone in the audience. "This emergency meeting is now called to order," Lindsay announced, banging her wooden gavel with more force than necessary. Her voice was steady, but carried an unmistakable undertone of nervousness. "We're here tonight to address some unfortunate misunderstandings and miscommunications regarding our neighborhood entrance improvement project." Before she could continue, Mr. Peterson, a 70-year-old retired military officer who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, stood up from his seat in the front row. "Misunderstandings," he said in his commanding voice that still carried echoes of his decades in the Army. "Mrs. Walsh, are you seriously calling illegal construction on private property a simple misunderstanding?" Lindsay tried to regain control of the room with her practiced political skills. "Mr. Peterson, we appreciate your concern, but there seems to be some confusion about our legal agreements with Mr. Martinez. We had a clear verbal understanding about the use of that land for community improvements." I stood up slowly, letting the room fall completely silent before I spoke. "No, Lindsay, there was never any agreement, verbal or otherwise, and I have documentation that will prove it beyond any reasonable doubt." I opened my briefcase and removed my tablet computer, connecting it to the portable projector that the community center had provided for the meeting. Before we examine the evidence, I continued, I want everyone in this room to understand exactly who I am and what qualifications I bring to this discussion. My name is David Martinez, and I am a senior inspector with the Harrison County Land Management Bureau. A collective murmur of surprise rippled through the packed room. Many of my neighbors looked genuinely shocked. For 15 years, they had known me simply as the quiet guy who works for the government and keeps to himself. Let's start with the most basic facts, I said, as the first image appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. This is the official cadastral survey map of our neighborhood, maintained by the county assessor's office and updated continuously with legal precision. The detailed map showed every property boundary in our area, with my land clearly outlined in bright red lines and the contested construction zone highlighted in contrasting yellow. The visual evidence was undeniable. The yellow construction area fell entirely within the red boundaries of my private property, with no overlap onto public land or HOA territory. And you can clearly see, I continued, the construction project is located entirely on my private property, approximately 15 feet from the nearest public right-of-way. Lindsay jumped to her feet, her face flushed with desperation and anger. That survey has to be wrong. We specifically checked the property boundaries before beginning construction. I turned to face her directly, maintaining my professional composure. Really, Lindsay, I'd be very interested to see the documentation of that boundary verification. Could you please share it with everyone here tonight? Lindsay opened and closed her mouth several times, but no words came out. She clearly had no documentation to present because no proper survey had ever been conducted. I advanced to the next slide on my presentation. Let's move on to the second major issue. According to county ordinances, any construction project of this scope requires proper building permits, regardless of who owns the land or who is doing the construction. Mrs. Walsh, could you please show us the permits that were obtained for this project? Tom Bradley, one of the board members, found enough courage to speak up. Lindsay told us that internal HOA projects on community land didn't require county permits. She said it was just a bureaucratic formality that we could skip. I nodded sympathetically. I understand the confusion, Tom, but that information is completely incorrect, even if this were community-owned land, which it clearly is not. A project of this magnitude would still require multiple permits, environmental impact assessments, and community notification procedures. Let's examine the third piece of evidence, I said, advancing to the next slide. This is a complete audio recording of my telephone conversation with Mrs. Walsh from 3 weeks ago, where I specifically asked about the project's impact on my property. I pressed play on my tablet, and Lindsay's voice filled the silent room through the sound system. You don't need to concern yourself with this project, David. This is internal HOA business, and frankly, you don't have any right to interfere with community improvements. The recording continued with my voice asking, but Lindsay, what if this construction affects my property boundaries? And Lindsay's dismissive response, your property, David, that land belongs to the HOA. You only own the area inside your fence line. The room fell into complete stunned silence. Present-day Lindsay was sitting at the head table with her face drained of all color, looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Mrs. Chen stood up from her seat near the middle of the room. Mrs. Walsh, I have a very important question for you. Did you know at the time of this phone call that Mr. Martinez was a county land inspector? Lindsay's response was barely audible. Well, because, interjected Attorney Miller, a lawyer who lived in the next block. If you knew his professional credentials and still deliberately proceeded with this illegal construction, that would constitute a serious criminal offense under state law. At this moment, Robert Walsh stood up from his seat in the very back of the room where he'd been sitting separately from his wife. I need to say something that everyone should hear, he announced in a clear, carrying voice. I warned my wife repeatedly about the legal problems with this project. I told her we needed to conduct proper property surveys and obtain all required permits before breaking ground. But Lindsay dismissed my concerns and told me that David is just a low-level clerk who wouldn't dare challenge us. You could hear Lindsay's sharp intake of breath echo through the silent room. But that's not all, Robert continued, his voice growing stronger with each revelation. Lindsay also deliberately manipulated the HOA regulations to target David with unfair fines. She unilaterally changed the grass height requirement from 6 inches to 4 inches without any community vote or notification, specifically to create a violation that she could use against him. Sarah Kim, the remaining board member, suddenly found her voice. Robert is telling the truth. Lindsay presented the regulation change to us as just a minor technical update that didn't require community approval. I opened the final section of my presentation, and here we have the official damage assessment report that I filed with the county yesterday. The screen showed photographs of my destroyed garden, along with detailed cost estimates for restoration. Then OU's illegal construction has caused approximately $15,000 in direct damage to my landscaping, plus additional costs for soil remediation and complete garden restoration. Under county law, the Homeowners Association is liable for these damages, plus punitive fines that could reach $50,000 or more. The room erupted into angry voices and heated discussions as neighbors turned to each other with outrage and disbelief. Lindsay finally reached her breaking point and exploded. This is completely unfair. Everything I did was for the good of this community. David has been plotting against me from the very beginning. He planned this whole situation to destroy me. I maintained my calm, professional demeanor as I responded. Mrs. Walsh, I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply protecting my legal property rights using the knowledge and experience I've gained through 15 years of professional work in this field. You, on the other hand, have violated multiple laws and abused your position of trust. Mr. Peterson stood up with the bearing of a man accustomed to making important decisions under pressure. I formally motion that we vote immediately to remove Mrs. Lindsay Walsh from her position as HOA president based on serious legal violations, abuse of power, and breach of fiduciary duty to this community. Ms. Chen's hand shot up instantly. I second that motion. A chorus of voices from throughout the room called out, I second it, too, and let's vote now. The vote was conducted by written ballot to ensure complete fairness and transparency. When the votes were counted by 3 volunteer residents, the results were overwhelming. 187 votes in favor of removal. Only 3 votes to retain Lindsay in office and 10 blank ballots. Lindsay Walsh was officially and immediately removed from her position as HOA president. She stood up from the head table, tears streaming down her face, but her voice was filled with rage rather than sadness. You're all going to regret this decision. This neighborhood will turn into a complete disaster zone without my leadership and vision. Then she turned to face me directly, pointing her finger accusingly. And you, David, you're going to pay dearly for what you've done to me. I looked at her calmly and spoke my final words to her as a member of our community. Mrs. Walsh, you've already paid the price for your own actions, and you should consider yourself fortunate that I chose to resolve this situation through legal and civilized means rather than pursuing the maximum criminal penalties that your actions could have justified. Justice had been served and Lindsay's reign of suburban tyranny was officially over. But the story of our neighborhood's recovery was just beginning. Now came the much more difficult task of rebuilding trust, establishing transparent governance, and healing the divisions that Lindsay's manipulative leadership had created among neighbors who would have to continue living side by side for years to come. 2 weeks after that historic and emotionally charged community meeting, I found myself standing in my lovingly restored garden on a perfect Saturday morning, admiring the vibrant green shoots that were already beginning to emerge from the rich, newly replaced soil. The professional landscaping company I had hired had worked tirelessly for 10 days straight to repair all the damage, and their results exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. My doorbell rang just as I was adjusting the sprinkler system, and I opened the front door to find Mrs. Chen standing on my porch with a warm, fragrant apple pie balanced carefully in her hands. "Good morning, David," she said with the kind of genuine, warm smile that I hadn't seen from any of my neighbors in months. "I thought you might enjoy some fresh homemade pie as a small token of our appreciation." I accepted the still warm pie gratefully. "Mrs. Chen, this is incredibly thoughtful of you, but you really didn't need to go to all this trouble." She shook her head firmly. "Oh, but I absolutely did need to, David. We all did. You single-handedly saved this entire neighborhood from a dictator who was destroying everything we valued about our community. Since Lindsay's dramatic removal from office, the positive changes throughout Oakwood Heights had been remarkable and swift. The interim HOA board, consisting of Tom Bradley, Sarah Kim, and Mr. Peterson, had immediately launched a comprehensive financial audit of all association accounts and expenditures. The results of their investigation were truly shocking. Lindsay had spent $45,000 from the community fund on various improvement projects without obtaining required member approval, and $12,000 of that money had been paid directly to a construction company that turned out to be owned by Lindsay's brother. A clear conflict of interest that bordered on criminal fraud. Tom Bradley had called me personally to deliver a heartfelt apology. "David, I am truly ashamed of how we treated you. We trusted Lindsay completely and never questioned her explanations. She constantly told us that you were just a troublemaker who opposed any kind of progress or community improvement." I appreciated his honesty and responded, "Tom, what matters now is that we create transparent systems and clear procedures to prevent this kind of abuse from ever happening again in our neighborhood." And that's exactly what we accomplished over the following months. During our next community meeting, the residents unanimously approved what we called the Oakwood Heights Transparency Charter, a comprehensive set of governance rules that I helped draft using my professional expertise in municipal regulations. The charter established 5 fundamental principles. First, all projects exceeding $1,000 in cost must be approved by community vote. Second, complete financial statements must be published monthly and made available to all residents. Third, no board member can modify any HOA regulations without obtaining 60% approval from the membership. Fourth, all property boundary disputes must be resolved through official county surveys. And fifth, a board must include at least one member with professional experience in law, engineering, or public administration. As for Lindsay herself, the county prosecutor filed formal charges against her on 3 serious counts: willful violation of private property rights, criminal abuse of office, and financial fraud involving community funds. Robert Walsh filed for divorce within a week of the emergency meeting and moved out of state to live with his sister's family. Their house went on the market immediately after the first court hearing, and they accepted the first offer they received, which was 20% below the asking price due to the legal controversy surrounding the property. What surprised me most during this entire ordeal was the unexpected offer I received from my neighbors. Mr. Peterson came to my house one evening and asked if I would consider running for HOA president in the upcoming election. "David," he said earnestly, "everyone in this community trusts you completely now. You have the knowledge, the experience, and most importantly, you have the integrity and moral character that we need in a leader." I gave his proposal serious consideration for several days before politely declining. "Mr. Peterson, I'm deeply honored by everyone's confidence in me, but I believe my role should be as an advisor and consultant rather than as the person in charge. Real power should be distributed among multiple people, not concentrated in the hands of any single individual. Instead of the traditional single president model, I proposed a rotating leadership council with 3 co-presidents who would serve staggered 18-month terms and share decision-making responsibilities equally. Chen was unanimously elected as our first co-president, along with Tom Bradley, who had learned valuable lessons from his experience with Lindsay, and Ms. Rivera, a civil engineer who had recently moved to our neighborhood and brought valuable technical expertise to infrastructure decisions. 6 months later, on another beautiful Saturday morning, I was watering my prize-winning rose garden when I heard the delightful sound of children's laughter drifting over my fence. I looked across the yard and saw the Harrison family, the young couple with 2 elementary school children who had purchased Lindsay's former house, playing an energetic game of tag in their backyard. They had bought the property at a substantial discount and were clearly thrilled to be part of our community. Dr. Harrison, who worked as an emergency room physician at the regional medical center, had introduced himself during their first week in the neighborhood. "I heard through the grapevine that you're the person who saved this community from a corrupt HOA president. That takes real courage and integrity." I smiled and responded modestly, "I didn't save anyone, Doctor Harrison. I just helped people see the truth that was already there waiting to be discovered." Now, during my evening walks through the neighborhood, I could see positive transformations everywhere I looked. The community garden had been completely replanted using voluntary donations and labor from dozens of residents who wanted to contribute to our collective recovery. The children's playground had been upgraded with new, safer equipment purchased with money we saved by canceling Lindsay's unnecessary and expensive projects. Most importantly, people were talking to each other again, having genuine conversations over backyard fences, organizing block parties, and working together on projects that actually benefited everyone. Mrs. Chan often stops by my house for coffee and conversation, and she frequently tells me, "David, do you know what the most valuable thing that came out of this whole terrible experience? It's not that you defeated Lindsay, although that was certainly important. The real victory is that you taught all of us how to stand up for what's right, how to question authority when it becomes corrupt, and how to work together to protect the things we value most about our community." That evening, as the streetlights began to glow softly in the gathering dusk, I sat on my front porch with a steaming mug of coffee, looking down at the new neighborhood sign that had been installed at the entrance to Oakwood Heights, a community built on transparency, respect, and justice. The sign had been Mrs. Chen's idea, and it was paid for by donations from residents who wanted a permanent reminder of the lessons we had learned together. As I sat there reflecting on everything that had happened, I suddenly understood the most important lesson that had emerged from our battle against corruption and abuse of power. Sometimes the people who seem weakest and most vulnerable actually possess the greatest strength, not the kind of strength that comes from money or political connections, but the much more powerful strength that comes from truth, patience, perseverance, and an unwavering. I realized that sometimes all it takes to transform an entire community is one ordinary person who has enough courage to stand up and say, "No, this is wrong, and I'm not going to let it continue." When the streetlights reached their full brightness, I noticed the small wooden sign that Mrs. Chen had made and planted in my front garden as a surprise. "Thank you, David, guardian of Oakwood Heights." I smiled, not because I enjoyed being praised or recognized, but because I knew with absolute certainty that the next time someone tried to abuse power or manipulate our community, it wouldn't be just one person standing up to oppose them. It would be all of us, united in our commitment to the principles we have fought so hard to establish and protect. The greatest lesson from this entire experience isn't about defeating bad people or winning battles against corruption. The real victory is in building systems and communities where bad people can't survive, where transparency prevents abuse, and where ordinary citizens have the knowledge and courage to protect the things that matter most to all of